Everyone, I'm Jeremy, the co-founder and CEO of Exospace. We build localized computing devices for satellites. So this is an example of our device. It's a small hardware device that plugs directly into the camera feed of a satellite and can process raw images from the satellite in real time to identify events or objects of interest in space.
Sweet, thanks, Jeremy. Moving down the line, let's go with Matt.
I'm Matt Villareal, founder and CEO of Infinite Composites, and we design, develop, and manufacture the most efficient storage systems in the universe for high pressure and cryogenic fluids. This is an example of one of our tanks, primarily go in rockets, satellites, ground-based trucks, and infrastructure. And we make them much lighter weight than anyone else.
Thanks, Matt. Yanni?
Hey guys, my name is Yanni Barghouty. I'm the co-founder and CEO of Cosmic Shielding Corporation, and we provide the current world-leading radiation shielding composites. We've developed a multifunctional shielding polymer that can either act as a secondary shield inside a device or as a structural shielding element. And the idea behind this is to enable the operational life extension for various spacecraft, enable payload flexibility, and eventually safe travels for human beings in space.
Thanks, Yanni. So as you guys are probably all aware, all three of these companies are raising on Space Ventures right now. We have as well the founders of Space Ventures. Aaron, do you want to kind of introduce Space Ventures a little bit and yourself?
Yeah, Aaron Burnett, founder and CEO of Space Ventures. What we do really is try and aggregate the world's largest community of space investors, bring them what we believe to be the best space companies that are willing to raise and want to raise from the public and get the public involved. Right now it's mainly and only really U.S. residents that we're supporting. At some point may extend that, but we are a equity crowdfunding platform, and we always are talking with space companies and trying to aggregate the world's largest community of space investors, which is well on its way already. So yeah, all the guys on the platform, or all the founders here that you're talking to, the three of them, they are currently raising on the Space Ventures platform. I'm regulated by FINRA, so I'm going to say this, and then just keep this in mind. None of this is none of this is investment advice. This is kind of an opportunity to talk with space founders that are in it day to day, doing some really cool stuff. I obviously think they're the world's best, but I'm biased, so you have to take that all with a grain of salt. That's it. That's kind of my spiel. Not investment advice. If you do have questions about the raise and that deal terms and all that kind of stuff, just go over to the website. Hopefully after this is done, and you can check out and ask questions and stuff there too. If it's more tech related, founder related, that life related, this is probably better for this forum right now. So that's my spiel.
Sweet. And Jivika, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. My name is Jivika. I'm the operations manager at Space Ventures. So I've worked very closely with Jeremy, Matt, and Yanni to pull together their pitches. And I'm here as tech support for today. So if you have any issues with that, feel free to message me directly. But I'll mostly kind of be in the behind the scenes and kind of managing the chat. And if you have questions, again, please put those in the chat. And feel free to show your face. This is going to be an interactive conversation. We kind of want to see who we're talking to, wherever you're joining from. This is the reason we don't have it as a webinar today. We're just doing it a regular Zoom because we kind of want to know who the heck is reading Orbital Index, who the heck is reading Space Ventures emails. I don't know, we'll find out. So excited to be here with all of you today.
Yeah. Yeah, Andrew and I are Orbital Index. Andrew, do you want to kind of talk a little bit about what we do?
Sure. So Ben and I are co-authors of Orbital Index. We do a weekly newsletter about the space industry. My background, well, both of our backgrounds are in software. I work on aerospace software. I've been at a couple of aerospace companies now. And I do a fair amount of research about the space industry. Ben, do you want to do a quick intro as well?
Yeah, for sure. So my background is more startups. I am a startup coach in the renewable energy space, and I work with an incubator in Ohio. I also have a background in software and have been interested in space and an enthusiast since I think growing up watching Nova and Star Trek. And yeah, Andrew and I are longtime friends and actually kind of grew up together. So yeah, we're super and happy to be here and talking with everybody. And I will totally echo what Jivika said. Please feel free, if you are comfortable with it, turning on your camera and so we can see who we're talking to. So yeah, with that, let's like jump into the discussion part. I think kind of one of the things that I wanted to start off with is how you guys each got to being founders of NewSpace startups. And we were talking a little bit before. I found Matt, your story kind of interesting. Can you talk about that a little bit? And then Yanni and Jeremy, if you want to jump in and share your experience as well, I would love to hear it.
Sure. Yeah. So our company, Infinite Composites, started back in 2010, actually, while my co-founder and I were seniors in college at Oklahoma State University. We were both in the business school, but we joined an engineering club that was racing quarter-scale Formula One cars. They had to raise all the money. They had to, recruit the team and then take the car to competition. So we didn't have any money. So we converted our car to run on compressed natural gas, which uses a high pressure tank for storing the gas. We did a 24-hour endurance race with it and realized the tank was a major limiting factor. It was too heavy, it didn't hold enough fuel, and it was just impractical. So we started looking for other methods of storing gas. And found an article in Composites World magazine that said linerless composite tanks were the holy grail of gas storage, and they could revolutionize space exploration and sustainable transportation. And I came up with an idea for how to do it, and we just really started by participating in business plan competitions. My degree was in entrepreneurship, so I started using my classes as kind of a way to develop business plans and financing plans, stuff like that. And then just started very organically, just decided to do it and put $500 each in. And yeah, now here 11 years later.
Nice. And as far as your pressure vessels go, like talk a little bit about how you're making them also. I think probably most people are at least a little bit familiar with like COPVs, but what makes your vessels like different?
Yeah, so our tanks use a linerless design. So typically you have a metal or plastic liner on the inside of the tank. Then to reinforce it to handle higher pressures, you wrap it in carbon fiber. So this is one of our tanks cut open. It's nothing but a carbon fiber shell with a metal interface on the end. So that reduces the mass by about 40%, cost by 50%, and lead time by 80% versus a lot of your state-of-the-art metal line pressure vessels. So it's one continuous string of carbon fiber. We joke that we're basically storing hydrogen gas with string and glue. That's really what it is. But yeah, it's all wrapped, CNC controlled, and the process kind of looks like a spider wrapping its prey. It's the original additive manufacturing process.
Cool. Yanni, you guys are also doing composites, but in a different, angle. How did you get started in the composite world?
Yeah, for sure. So it's funny because Matt and I see eye to eye on the future of composites in space, and that's one thing that I think is just at the beginning. But yeah, so quick background. I actually have a background in biomedical engineering from Georgia Tech, so not space related. I had a previous startup that did well for a bit. We ended up, going separate ways due to some other issues, but I always wanted to get into space. And just to give some background on the interest in this space or industry. My parents are both theoretical astrophysicists, and they have been honestly going back to grandparents. And my dad actually did a lot of, when I was a kid, I remember him doing a lot of research, fundamental research on cosmic ray origins and so forth. Right? So I remember coincidentally reading about some of the explosion in the NewSpace economy earlier last year. And at that point, I was looking to get into a new industry. And a lot of the things I saw were kind of creating a perfect storm for the need for some of the applications of this, early physics and science. And I mean, you have on-orbit servicing popping up, you have electric propulsion, and then simultaneously you have some people launching spacecraft made of heavy metals, right? So this is great because one of the things that my dad's team, and then our founder, Dr. Lambert Seaver, he actually is known for developing a HZ turn model, which modeled the heavy ion transport through materials and was very good at calculating secondary radiation. So believe it or not a lot of companies focus on these secondary. Metals produce these secondaries. So what I saw is a chance to jump in with a material that already had a lot of physics legwork done, a lot of testing legwork done through Lembit. And I told Lembit, I was like, if you can get the old teams together from NASA SHRAG, JAXA, and ESA, I can get this funded. And I think there's a huge opportunity here to actually make a difference in the industry and kind of smooth out the headaches that a lot of companies are going to have with that solving. So, we got to it. We started working with the MIT Metamaterials Lab on just actual production techniques and so forth. Came up with the ideal composition, but more importantly, believe it or not, the production method is actually key. Because what I saw the future in is the idea that we're using metal spacecraft right now. The only reason we're using those is because we have before. I don't see any real technical reason why you want aluminum frame spacecraft. It's like when you have aircraft from the old days, you had propeller-based aircraft, so wooden frames were good enough for the stresses they experience. Once you move towards jet engines, all of a sudden the wood wasn't cutting it. We're in the same transitionary period now. I think composites are going to be replacing these metal frames. Now, what we focused on was the secondary effects. That was what kind of gave us our edge, I think, or is currently giving us our edge. Because what I see is the futures in structural shielding. I want to give companies the flexibility to not have to worry about adding extra weight and internal componentship. I want them to, if they want to, have a complete alternative to aluminum in their satellites that reduces the complexity of the overall system and also enables you to have some worry-free use of COTS components, commercial off-the-shelf, extend your operational life, and then have people on board a space station without having to worry about any secondary or damaging health effects over time. So that's kind of a vision why we started it and so forth.
Sweet. I think we'll get back to that in a little bit. I know Andrew has a question there. Jeremy, do you want to jump in and talk about Exospace and how you got to building computers that are in LEO?
Yeah, definitely. So I have a bit different background. So my background is actually in space. So I got my master's in astronautical engineering. Before that, my background was in software development. So the idea of Exospace, or how we ended up here, was kind of a culmination of my experiences, my work experience before this. So my first job after graduate school was working at the Space Engineering Research Center in Marina del Rey, California. So I was the lead software developer for a CUBE satellite, which, if you don't know what a CUBE satellite is, it's basically a small satellite that's like the size of a loaf of bread. So I was developing software for that, and once that project was done, I went on to NASA JPL, and I was developing software for satellites there. Well, I should go back and say the first thing that I really learned working on the CUBE satellite was that microelectronics can actually be used in space, or at least in LEO at this point. They drastically reduce your lead time, reduce your cost, and they don't really increase risk if you design properly. So microelectronics was a great thing to learn at that stage. And then going to NASA JPL, my biggest takeaway was that satellites really weren't as intelligent as I thought they were. What I mean by this, well, not to say the science isn't amazing, like the scientific instruments they're developing and the science they're doing is very cutting edge, but the underlying architecture, software architecture that sort of controls the satellites is very rigid, and it's kind of designed in a certain way, and once it's on orbit, you don't really change it. So taking those two experiences, I felt like there was really a big opportunity to have high-powered computing, localized computing in space that has a flexible enough architecture where customers can upload new say machine vision models or new applications that they want to work with, and sort of change in real time to market needs. So that's kind of how Exospace started.
Cool. Andrew, did you have a question there?
I actually had a question for Yanni about the radiation shielding. I'm curious if you could talk a little bit about sort of the different, do you need different types of shielding for the different types of radiations that you encounter, either, in the Van Allen belts versus, in deep space where you're dealing more with like cosmic rays?
Yeah.
Maybe you can talk about that a little bit.
So with the particle-based radiation sources, you don't actually, the principles are the same, essentially. You have different like species of actual particles, but the general principles on how you protect against them, that stays the same. But where you have some different kind of needs is like, say you're like, in geo, you have a much higher electron content that you need to protect against that causes surface charging and so forth, transitioning through the Van Allen belt, same issue. Now, the key is like, how do you add in, the good thing about composites is it allows you to tackle all of these properties at one time if you build it right. So basically, to really simplify, how do you protect against particles? You want to reduce or increase the energy deposition of the particle in your shield, which means kind of force it to break up in your shield, catch the secondaries that are produced, right? And there's a very simple principle here. The lower the atomic weight, the better. So hydrogen-rich materials are very good at slowing down, not stopping, it's not magic, it's just slowing down heavy ions and solar particles, solar protons even, right? Now, a lot of the metals, when people look at metal-graded Z shielding, those are very good, and those are designed with electrons in mind, some of the X-rays and gamma rays. The problem with them is that you produce more gamma rays and X-rays in the shield itself than what you're actually blocking, right? So all we did, right, and I won't say all we did, it was, well, the production, like I said, was the most difficult part, is we created a new polymer where in the actual chain, we included certain additives and so forth to catch electrons, to catch the Bremsstrahlung, which are like secondary photons, catch X-rays and gamma rays. So this is distributed throughout the entire material. So you have a constant slowdown of the particle, and you're causing some, or you're forcing some target fragmentation on like the hydrogen in the shield, and you're catching the the particles that are emitted after that. So that's a very, very simplistic way of looking at it, but generally speaking, this is why composites are so key. You want to incorporate many different properties without sacrificing mechanical strength. You don't want to, for example, having discrete layers that adds a lot of issues with hot spots and other stress points in the material. So which is why we wanted to do it on like the molecular scale with the polymer itself. And that's where our work with MIT came in. But you can actually optimize this. So it's actually interesting. One of the clients we're working with now, very new, is focused on different types of radiation, say on terrestrial applications with a very lightweight, X-ray gamma ray shield. You can actually change the additives and focus on that also. So it's flexible in that sense.
Yanni, does that, like for deep space missions, does that change the profile of that material, your material at all, or is it just as applicable in deep space as it is in, like through the, cislunar space or, LEO?
Yeah, so the base formula, if you want to think of the base composition that we have right now, is the same for LEO as it is for deep space. Now, if you're talking about, depending on what application you're looking at, like if it's for electronics, your operational lifetime goal, or mostly the total dose you can take, or the LET goal you have, then we modify the thickness, of course, that's the simplest variable there. But generally speaking, the order and ratios are the same if you're in LEO or GEO. Now, you can do some tweaks, but for now, just for simplicity's sake on the demo product, there's no variation between LEO and GEO.
I think, like Andrew and I have always been, very, future looking into the deep space challenges that we'll have as we kind of break out of, Earth orbit and kind of, start to go other places. Jeremy, I think as we move out of Earth orbit and out of LEO, is that kind of on orbit computing, does it translate into the deep space mission potentially as well? Is that something that you guys are thinking about or have interest in? Yeah,
definitely. There's arguably even more of a need for it the further you go from Earth. because all of our data processing centers, even for low Earth orbit satellites, all of those processing centers are located on the Earth. So the further you move away from the Earth, the longer the time it takes to actually send the data and then process it. So in the industry, they call it data latency. And to give you an example, the Artemis program that NASA's proposing to go back to the moon. If they were to send all their computations back from the moon to Earth, the round trip travel time is about 2.5 seconds for the speed of light. And so the interesting thing is that might not sound very slow, like that might not sound like a big deal, but if you have life critical systems or very important support systems that are operating on that might need like data to tell them when they need to shut down or when they might be going bad, or anything that tells more information about how they should operate, 2.5 seconds is actually a really long time. And then if you look at missions to Mars, the average round trip travel time there is 18 minutes. So there's really it's not really possible to have like good communication between the Earth and Mars if you really need to compute something quickly or have an answer. So yeah, we're definitely focused on the moon and Mars for our future missions. But actually right now we found a lot of use cases focusing on Earth applications and low Earth orbit. So like, for example, we're working with a customer to track illegal fishing activity in Southeast Asia because they use satellite imagery to try and intercept illegal fishing vessels, but a lot of the times the photos don't come in time for them to actually intercept. So we're planning to use the architecture that we developed for this stage to apply it to more deep space missions.
I'm curious how the newest generation of machine learning processors for mobile phones is affecting your work. Either I know Google just released an embedded machine learning processor, and Apple has their Tensor. Google's is the Tensor processor, I believe. Are you able to access the newest generation of these chips, or are these ending up quite proprietary to the companies like Google and Apple?
Yeah, so we have been working with open source processors that you've mentioned. So really any machine vision accelerator is something that we're using to at least test our product. So we have our first launch in next October of 2022 to sort of test out our first device. And we're using an off-the-shelf processor for that launch. But we're also looking into more proprietary or more like in-house built solutions as well. The nice thing about the off-the-shelf processors is that the great thing is, you can basically buy them and you have them in a week. So you can do very quick prototyping. They're affordable. And so yeah, there's definitely a great use case. And, a lot of the industry, if they're doing machine vision, machine learning, they're using the architecture, the frameworks like TensorFlow and Keras that Google has developed. So, we're trying to build a community of people who also want to just upload their own models to our device. And so it makes it more accessible for those people as well.
That makes sense. There was an audience question. Peter was asking Matt how the linerless COPVs maintain their shape during the weaving process. Maybe you can talk a little about that.
Yeah, so typically, in lined COPVs, you use the metal or plastic liner to hold the shape and wrap around. We form the same shape, but and then we wind on top of it, and then we extract that mandrel out of the tank through a tiny port. So basically, it's rigid until we process it, and then it allows us to extract it out and reuse the material.
And Matt, one of the things as I was thinking about what you guys are doing, like, is part of the benefit of linerless, like longer term cryogenic fuel storage, because I from time to time, and thinking about like longer duration stuff, like boil off is a huge issue. But to be honest, like usually it's just kind of thrown out there, right? As like, oh, you know, like we have to deal with boil off, right? Like, can you talk a little bit about how that affects, you know, your stuff and more generally as well?
Yeah, so I mean, in general, an all composite tank is going to have, in my opinion, better thermal properties than a metal lined tank. You're not dealing with as much boil off as you would if you have a big metal mass in there that's just transferring the heat. As far as long-term cryo storage, we're still we have some cryo products developed, but you know, they're still progressing. So we haven't done you know, multi-year cryogenic storage, but I think composite materials will enable that. You know, they don't see the same kind of fatigue as metal line tanks do. So theoretically, you can get many more cycles out of them before you know, needing to replace them or rework them or anything like that. So I think the composites are going to actually enable you know, longer term storage, being able to go to colder temperatures, and you know, being more practical in both in space and on Earth.
You know, one thing that I can only assume will affect all of you guys that we talk about a good bit at Orbital Index is kind of like the proliferation of you know, objects in LEO and Earth orbit in general. Do you guys see that like affecting your businesses? You know, short term, long term? Is it something that you know, space is big, we don't have to worry about it? Like, you know, what do you all think about that?
One thing that I've sorry, go ahead. I was just gonna say, one thing that I've seen recently is a lot more requirements for full demisability, which means removing some of the metallic structures that won't burn up in the atmosphere. You know, you can't use over a certain size or mass of titanium. So that actually makes it, you know, better for us because, you know, we can make our tanks fully demisable. As far as, you know, more space objects, I think one of the benefits that our technology will further enable is in-space refueling, so that you know, it's not just dead objects that are floating around in a graveyard orbit, but you know, it can enable bring back, you know, satellites that have already kind of ended their life and make them usable again, and then also it can make you know, satellites that are new satellites and objects that are going up last longer. So that's how I think our technology could help reduce that problem.
Yeah, and I just wanted to say about that too. I do think that, well, I don't think that space is too big and that, you know, we don't have to worry about the LEO problem with a lot of satellites. That's definitely a huge issue. And, you know, there are a lot of mitigations in place already to be able to track objects in space and see, you know, and plot their trajectories to see if there's going to be a conjunction or anything like that. In regard to our device, our technology, you know, we're planning to launch with other satellites in LEO. And we actually, one big thing that we're pushing for is improved space situational awareness. So because our device can process vision or photo data, or, you know, even video data, it helps with safety of flight for rendezvous and docking procedures, because you can actually have a visual inspection and sort of real-time analysis on where two satellites are when they get close to each other. So that's something we definitely want to focus on for LEO applications. And yeah, I think the problem of putting a lot of satellites in LEO is definitely a real issue that needs to be addressed.
On that same note, I do believe that, I hope, I think we're going to see it though. I think that over the next few years, we're going to see a slow reduction in the amount of waste produced in space. I think one of the reasons is that CubeSats and small sats are increasingly being seen as less disposable. A lot of the more advanced technologies that, you know, previously reserved for larger craft are now moving towards the CubeSat and small sat form factor. Then when you add in the ability to service the craft itself, you know, more advanced components that are doing giving the craft a higher priority in terms of operational expense and just maintaining it, then I think doing all we can to enable the components to last longer, it's going to lead to just less production. I think the move towards composite shielding, composite structures, is going to be a natural kind of reduction in the waste in space. So from our end, all we're trying to do to kind of help nudge the market in that direction is give people a little less headache when it comes to trying to time their degradation of their spacecraft and seeing how long it lasts. But I think it's going to be a natural progression of it.
Yeah, I think as I think about it, I kind of wonder, like we're moving the whole industry from single-use objects over to some form of reusability or like mission extension or and I think that like there's also at the same time this as you said, Yanni, like the technology that was reserved for $100 million satellites is now much more accessible. Maybe it's not made it quite to the like 1U form factor, but like it's getting there. Like what size craft are each of you like on the small side? What do you support? Like, is it 1U, 3U? Like, how small? How big are you today?
If I were to just jump in and answer that, from a current production limitation perspective, the most now, and this is new, after doing some initial validation on whether or not we can actually produce this on scale effectively, it seems like we can. For the next few months, we're going to be limited to small craft just by nature of the production volume of the printers we use. And that's probably craft you could say up to like 4 or 5U. But the goal is there's no reason it can't be used on any scale of craft. Of course, I mean, if you're doing a space station, you're going to have to do panels and so forth. We'll see how that'll work. But yeah, the idea is to service any range. And even with the larger craft, though, we are looking at just smaller component shields. So direct, little boxes to shield avionics packages and so forth. We're actually working on those with a few clients, or a few of those with a few clients now.
For us, I mean, we're servicing basically our manufacturing equipment right now can produce up to 30-inch diameter by up to 10-foot long tanks. We're working on bringing in some new equipment to go up to 5-foot diameter by 50 feet long. So we're servicing some very small projects that the tanks are only 2.5-inch diameter. We have some that are like 13, 14-inch diameter, all the way up to 25-inch diameter right now. So we're applicable to a lot of different vehicle architectures, and so we're constantly finding new and larger applications that we can support. So
Matt, like translate that into like real world, like what uses a 50-foot by 5-foot diameter pressure vessel?
Yeah, so that wouldn't be a satellite application. That'd be more like a launch vehicle or a ground-based gas transportation module. But there are some vehicles that are not launch vehicles that they wouldn't use that long of a tank, but they may use a 5-foot diameter by 5-foot kind of near sphere type of tank.
Jeremy, how about you guys? What size craft are you guys on? Mostly cubes?
Yeah, for us, well, for our first mission for next October, we're going to be on a 1U platform. So, well, our device is 1U, so that's like 4 inches squared. But we also plan to launch on much bigger satellites as well, which we would just add computing power. So it basically can scale like a server rack. And however big, however much computation we need to put up, we can do that on, whatever size satellite.
Yeah,
so
I had another. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, man.
No, you go for it, Andrew.
I was going to change the subject.
Go for it.
Yeah, I had a question for Yanni about the radiation shielding. When I look at the picture of your material, I immediately also think about Whipple shielding for space debris. And I'm curious if you've thought about, I know a variable density foam is actually potentially even better than a Whipple shield. Is there some sort of composite solution that does both radiation shielding and like micro debris protection?
Yes. Yeah, so that's exactly why we're looking at this like kind of fiber structure to sort of improve the impact resistance. It's something we're currently testing, and we're going to be running a lot of MMOG tests over the next few months to validate. I mean, theoretically speaking, yes, there's no reason you can't have a single layer satisfied with the impact mechanical, structural, and shielding properties. And one interesting thing is what we're seeing from very small scale lab tests. So we'll see if this holds, but generally speaking, you get the 30% improvement in like impact depth versus Kevlar using our filament. And keep in mind, I'm not sure if I made that clear, it's a filament. So we developed a filament for 3D printing, which is why we have some flexibility with form factors and so forth. But yeah, that's definitely a focus, and that's actually one of our main focuses. Because like I said, the shielding part was the less difficult part for at least our team. That's where we had more experience. And just for decades of, like I said, research, and Limbit's been doing this his whole life. However, the key is making it easy to integrate. So that's one of the reasons we're looking at mechanical properties.
That makes a lot of sense, yeah. And I guess if we're talking about radiation shielding, I'm also curious about, Jeremy, how you deal with the radiation environment. If you're dealing with, processors that I assume are coming from, cell phones and other sort of low power, high efficiency processors, how you deal with, latch ups or other sort of like space radiation events.
Yeah, that's a great question. So we have built our own in-house device that, well, basically radiation enclosure, but it's also a thermal management system. So it's kind of a standalone box that protects against cosmic rays. But after talking to Yanni these past couple of months, it seems like there's definitely room for improvement because we're using the older models, and so we plan to use cosmic shielding's radiation protection in the future. But for this first mission, the analysis that we've done, it should be okay. Regarding latch ups and all of those other things, we have software mitigations on board. Basically, if there's a single event upset or something like that, we just reset. We can just reset and then boot up again. So that's usually the way that it's done, or it's the easiest way to deal with COTS components in space. And since this is more of a proving mission, it is the best way to prototype and really work through that.
That's sort of just like a hardware watchdog timer that resets everything if it.
Exactly. Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah, Jeremy, on that note also, like, I see things like Perseverance where, like super CPU restrained, right? Running a RISC chip from the late 90s, right? Which is, I mean, it's rad hard, and that's like, it's a very expensive piece of equipment. But yeah, like what do you see being the future of radiation and like computing, particularly as you go out into deep space where it's even more of an issue? Yeah, like what do you think about that?
Yeah, I have thought about that a lot. Especially we thought about that in our early design phase. Like, do we want to do a radiation processor, like a rad hardened processor, or do we want to use off the shelf? I mentioned why we chose off the shelf briefly, but also it's more cost effective. The lead time is shorter, and you get access to state-of-the-art processors every year, basically. So I think personally, I could see servers in space, or a lot of computation on localized on rovers or on space stations, that kind of thing, which just have like a really awesome radiation shield, and then just have server racks lined in there. So you could easily replace the racks if you wanted to, but that kind of gives you access to, that's like true parallel computing in space and really cutting edge processing. So yeah, to me, that's where, at least that's where I'd like to see it go, but it also makes sense that it would kind of move that way. A lot of experts say that in the next 3 years, there's going to be over 1 million times more data generated in space every single day. And so even if this system works now, which is pretty slow, even if it did work now, in the future, this is going to be necessary to process on orbit.
Yeah, I know that's like the amount of data in orbit and in the future, even farther away, is just mind-boggling. And I think it's really interesting to look at like the effect of like data upload rates of past missions and how that's scaled, not as a like necessarily a predictor, but like it does give you a curve, right? And it's really going through the roof and will continue to do so. I can't see any reason why not. Taking kind of a hard turn, and then I think maybe we can start bringing some people up from the audience here pretty soon. All of you have done some amount of fundraising. Obviously, you're doing fundraising on Space Ventures right now. If you've had experiences with traditional VC fundraising, how does like equity crowdfunding, like how's that differed in your experience from traditional VC, and how does it kind of interact? I know one person was asking about cap tables in the chat.
Yeah, so we've raised about just over $4 million in funding, primarily from angel investors and groups. We do have a couple of VCs on our cap table. I would say that the diligence for Space Ventures was a lot more straightforward than most of the diligence with VCs. Oftentimes, there's not a lot who are really that familiar about hardware type business models. That's been one of the challenges for us. They oftentimes are asking about like your monthly recurring revenue and stuff like subscriber type stuff that's not applicable. So that's been a bit challenging. And then the other thing is that the diligence can drag on forever and ever. Some people will just keep asking new questions, circling back to old questions, stuff like that. And so that's one of the things I really like about Space Ventures is you get it all done up front. You can answer some questions, but the bulk of the work is kind of done before you start taking on investors. So I feel like it's better as far as a timeline perspective. I think that on the cap table side, I think there is some perception that equity crowdfunding, you're going to have 1 million people on your cap table. That's been the main feedback that I've got from some VCs and institutional investors, that's their concern. But with the Space Ventures, the special purpose entity type thing, it's really only one entry on your cap table, so it's not really an issue. That's basically what I've been telling the investors. It's our cap table already has quite a few people on it anyway, so you get what you get. But
yeah, no, that's changed recently and made it a lot better. Like that's a kind of a historic problem that is, I think, mostly or is in the process of being solved. Either of the other of you guys have like equity crowdfunding versus VC, and maybe merging the two experiences or thoughts?
Yeah, so I'll say we closed the $1 million round in April from a lot of the space VCs that are currently operating. That includes like Space Fund, World Quant, Helios, a few others. And we're currently at the tail end of an $8 million seed round to scale up with some more VCs, some more industry strategics. But I see the future of this, I think, is interesting because I think there's an opportunity for a mix of both. One very important aspect of, I think, crowdsourcing is that, first of all, interestingly, I was surprised by how stringent their requirements are. A lot of VCs aren't as thorough as the crowdfunding platforms because you have to be, when you're making public representations, which I think is a good practice for companies to get in right from the get-go, because that can really kind of shoot you in the foot later on if you're not keeping up to par with these practices. Yeah. Now, what's really interesting to me is the more so the PR of the image. It's good to share out, like, add in, much wider audience, especially when you talk about space, because of course this is the most I think, futurist industry you can be in. And I think allowing people to take part in that is important, but from a strategic point of view, it is good to have a lot of eyes on your company, especially when those eyes could be prospective employees, from their prospective customers. We've actually seen a decent bit of, actually we've had a few people reach out, like, looking for potential jobs in the future just by being listed. And that is probably one of the more important points of a deep tech company that most people tend to ignore, because when you get into deep tech, I thought this, I thought it was nothing, PR had nothing to do with it, right? It's all about the technology. That is, it's literally, PR is just as important in a deep tech company as it is if you're making a TikTok. It's the same thing. That and getting the public involved, I'm not kidding, it's actually just as important. You'd be surprised in some companies how you just use PR to build up and get their first clients, and then that is a feedback that gives you the chance to actually demonstrate on a large scale. But having the public involved does help you get those eyes on, and it trains you for how to be more effective at communicating with the public, which again you have to do. So that's my perspective.
We have an audience question, which I like, from Peter. I think he's probably referring to an article written by Casey Hammer recently that's claiming that sort of NASA and other organizations aren't really taking Starship seriously as the decrease in upmass costs that it's likely to result in if it's successful. And whether your companies who are very nascent and very early on this process are you assuming a world where upmass is a lot cheaper, and how is that changing your behavior? Like that paradigm shift that is probably going to happen. Any of the founders?
So I guess
I can. Yeah, go ahead, sorry, Yanni.
No, go ahead.
Okay, thanks. Okay. Yeah, so I was just going to say, at this point, no, it doesn't affect us whether or not Starship is, what it lives up to everything that they say it will. With launch costs right now, we were actually, with what we've raised through the Space Ventures platform, we were able to pay for our first launch and first prototype and first mission, basically. So right now, the way that we've decided to build our device and decided to scale, it really doesn't matter too much on Starship. And yeah, I mean, we want our device to be able to fit in really any launch vehicle. That's sort of where most of the value is for us, is higher cadence and also more competition between the launch companies, because then it ultimately leads to a more affordable price for us.
Jeremy, how much have you guys raised kind of total and then on Space Ventures?
So we haven't done any VC round yet. We've only raised on Space Ventures. I think we're at 138,000 roughly. So yeah. Yeah,
that's amazing. Like how much launch, like a 1U mission, like you can pay for it. That's cool. Andrew, do we have any other?
I'd be curious if either of the other founders want to take a shot at sort of thinking towards the future. Does if launch costs dramatically decrease, there's something like $1,500 or $2,000 a kilogram now, and Elon thinks they're going to be like, I don't remember, like $50 a kilogram or something ridiculous. But assuming it's like a couple $100 a kilogram, how that affects your business.
I think one good positioning of our business is that say that the launch that fails, there's no heavy lift vehicles or large volume of launches driving past, which again, I really don't see a scenario where that occurs as long as humanity's still around, because it's not like we're trying to crack micro fusion. It's just building another rocket and building the rockets on scale and making the business work out. It's going to happen. Now, the good thing about our system is that, so say they didn't, say for some reason launch costs stayed astronomically high, then you're going to have fewer opportunities to get a new spacecraft up. Your churn rate's going to be higher, so operational life matters. If the launch cost goes down, then there's a lot more opportunities for servicing and reservicing. So then again, the case may be made for operational life extension there again too. In any scenario, I think that's okay for us. But I think one of the more interesting aspects is going to be how these costs drop down for beyond LEO, towards cislunar and space. That's where the real challenge is, and I think that's personally what makes me excited. But from a business perspective, I don't think either way is not something that keeps me up at night.
I'll kind of second some of what Yanni said. Our technology has a lot of broad applications. I think that, I mean, personally, I think doubt Elon Musk at your own peril. He's proven people wrong that doubted him, but I think the launch cost lowering are going to accelerate more people needing more tanks to put on more different platforms to send into space. I mean, I think it's also inevitable. I mean, we're seeing so many inbound inquiries of new companies who have gotten funding and are building launch vehicles, satellites, other spacecraft. I think that there's too much momentum for the industry to not grow and continue on. Elon Musk's one player in it. He's probably progressing things faster than anybody else, but there's a lot of other people out there with capabilities to do that. So
yeah, it's definitely not just SpaceX.
Yeah.
Eduardo, you wanted to ask a question yourself. Can you turn on your camera and looks like you unmuted. Go for it.
Hey, my question is for Yanni. About the cosmic shielding, is that just for cosmic rays, or are they focusing it as well on like nuclear? Because we could use that here on Earth, and not just in space. That would be a very generic use here, if we could use that in the nuclear field.
Yeah, so that's a very good question. So the focus of the material was designed with solar radiation in mind and cosmic rays, but it also does provide protection against some of the low energy radiation sources you have, such as from nuclear power on Earth. Now, there's one important consideration. So on Earth, right, when you're dealing with like gamma and neutron radiation, which is what you usually have from power plants, right, it is in some ways lower energy than, you don't have extreme high energy particle radiation from these nuclear power sources. So if you're on the ground, it might make more sense to just use as much dense, heavy material, because on Earth, on a power plant, you don't care about weight. But the one aspect that we are looking into, and we actually have an exciting development here from a client perspective, but if you're dealing with aircraft, or you want to have some future flying nuclear powered thing, whether it's a spacecraft or aircraft,
Yeah.
then that makes sense. Then that does make sense, I think, and that is a future case. Now, to do that, to make it most efficient for the kind of radiation you have from nuclear power sources, there are some modifications that you need to do.
You need to take.
But yeah, that's why one of the core focuses was to make it a little easy to modify, to just change out additives for different sources. Yeah.
Makes sense. Thanks.
Thanks, Eduardo. I think Sahil, if you want to turn on your video and ask a question, go for it.
Yeah, so my question is basically, since you people are in the industry, have your pulse, and have just an overall like real-time understanding of what's going on in the industry, you all know that there's a lot of launch vehicles or launch startups coming into play, a lot of satellites and such. What are aspects in the industry or sectors in the industry that you see that there's not really enough like growth or interest or like momentum being generated, but could like generally overall just like push the industry up, like an undervalued sector?
I think power management systems are going to be the big future of the industry. Like so even if you have good shielding, you have on-orbit servicing, you have all these other factors, there's still some significant degradation on the solar panels on spacecraft, right? And we're looking at potential ways to do transparent shields in this. Even then, you're really limited. So I think power systems are somewhere where there's a lack of major startups or major developments, but that's not to say there's no attention there. There are a few nuclear propulsion startups, RTG-based startups that are popping up. But I think it's inevitable that the industry is going to start using those kinds of systems for power use in the future.
Oh, okay, but what? And then in a sense, what about the whole aspect where the defense and the defense sector has just stated that they're putting into this aspect like plasma thrusters as research? So that would change the whole aspect of what we would consider as power, right? Because or am I wrong?
Yeah, well, the great thing about those non-chemical propulsion methods, which again, I think those are inevitable as well. And we're just seeing the early stages. For example, most new craft being launched in the next few years are using Hall effect thrusters, which is amazing because that used to be very sporadically used. I mean, The next then step is to somehow improve like the specific impulse on these electric thrusters. And you do that, you're probably going to have actual spaceships that you think in a sci-fi sense. So that you're going to need good power management systems for that, and ones that last. So I think they're kind of symbiotic in that sense. They're one needs the other.
Thank you.
Anybody else have thoughts on like kind of unappreciated or underserved parts of the industry?
I don't know if it's
I do.
necessarily. Go ahead.
Go ahead, Matt. You got it. No, you
I
got
was
it.
going to say, I don't know if it's underutilized or underappreciated, but I think some of the areas that need a lot more attention are in situ resource utilization and in-space manufacturing. These things are starting to take off. I think they're probably some of the more important things to establish, permanent presence on the moon and eventually Mars and stuff like that. So that's what I'd like to see more focus on and more money being dumped into.
Yep, that's. I was going to second that. The orbital servicing and manufacturing, I think, is an area that is probably the most important at this point. Mainly because there's like building infrastructure in space. That's kind of not like an interesting or like the sexy part of space, but it's necessary. It's like deciding, what is the USB standard for a computer. That's kind of where the manufacturing in space is at right now. And so I think once a lot of that work gets kind of fleshed out and really agreed upon by the industry, then there's going to be a huge acceleration in a lot more space activity.
So basically just a uniformity of all like basic space products and space equipments overall in general.
Yeah, essentially like the analogy is like setting up DNS servers and routers and hardware devices that, that satellites that are going to work together in space have like a common communication protocol or a common protocol to actually do stuff, because that's when you can really scale and build like big structures.
But wouldn't that go against like conflict of the interest for like countries and such, which is because they would want to have there's information held like without being tapped, right?
So that's always the challenge, yeah. I mean, especially with the space industry, there are a lot of companies that try to keep their stuff proprietary, and they don't want to share that, even for common protocols. But I mean, that's the big issue that needs to be solved. I think once that's, that's what they were doing with computers before, and we figured it out. It seems like for the most part. So I think that analogy kind of makes sense to space as well. Well,
I think that's actually a really great wrap up from everybody. And Sahil, thanks for the question. It is 4 o'clock Eastern, 1 o'clock Pacific, and in the interest of like being aware of everybody's time, I think we should leave it here. I've really enjoyed this conversation, and everybody who's listening, please go subscribe to Orbital Index. You'll hear more about cool things like these guys are doing, and go check out their fundraising pages on Space Ventures. I think this has been super great. Thanks everybody for showing up, particularly Jeremy, Matt, Yanni. Really appreciate it.
Just before we go, I just wanted to say, if you had questions that weren't answered, you can definitely go onto the Space Ventures website and check out each of the company pages. We have a discussion tab going where you can post your questions directly, and our founders, the same founders that are in front of you right now, will respond to you directly. So feel free to do that if you feel like you had a great question and we just didn't have time for it this time.
Yeah, good point. Thank you. Well, I think that's it. Thanks so much, everybody. And hopefully we'll see you soon. If you enjoyed this, please reach out and tell us on Twitter, any other way that you feel like doing so. We're considering doing more things that are kind of in this lane. So everybody have a great afternoon.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
All right, thank you.